Nikolai Astrup, thank you so much for joining the NABA Perspectives podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before we get into the discussion, we're going to be talking about Norway and Africa, Norway-Africa relations in a changing world. We all know that the world is changing rapidly. Just give us a little bit of context for anyone who might not be familiar with you. We know you're a member of Parliament of Norway, but you're also a former development minister. Just a little bit of background on your work and how it relates to Africa to help set the scene.
Well, thank you. And again, thank you for having me. I'm, as you said, a member of Parliament. I have been a member of Parliament since 2009, but I'm also a former Minister of International Development. I'm a former Minister of Digitalization and a former Minister of Municipalities and or local government and modernization. In Parliament, I've served I chaired the Committee on Finance, I chaired the Committee on Transport and Communications, and I've also been, for many, many years, working on energy and environment issues in Parliament. So I've both in my work with energy and environment, but also not least as a Minister of International Development, I have worked with Africa and traveled in Africa, and hopefully I have something to contribute to the discussion.
I have no doubt about that, and I'm looking forward to your perspectives. Now, let's start with what is, in many ways, at least in Norway, the big story of the week when it comes to Africa, which is that the current government of Norway has just launched a new Africa strategy. It's the first time that we've seen a revamp of Norway's engagement with the continent since 2007, right, which is quite a while ago now. And it comes, and it's very timely in many ways, because as we know, over the last 2-3 years, we've seen rapid and arguably very profound change in the global economic landscape, the global geopolitical landscape. And Africa, in many ways, finds itself at the nexus of what's happening globally. We're seeing a real sort of a surge in interest from players all around the world who are looking to, sort of grow their influence on the continent, cement their influence on the continent. We're seeing more talk about geopolitical competition for access to resources and this and that. So it feels like a good time for Norway to take a step back, reevaluate its approach to the continent, and we now have a new strategy. So I'm just going to throw this to you now and say, what are your thoughts on the launching of the new strategy? And to what extent is it a step in the right direction in terms of adapting and evolving to also meet the needs of a rapidly changing continent?
Well, I mean, you're quite right. The geopolitical situation has changed a lot, and it is a new reality. But the new Africa strategy doesn't really reflect that, in my view. I think it is astonishing how thin the strategy is in many ways. There's little news and no new take on how to take on these challenges, how to navigate in these changing circumstances, and I think that's very disappointing, because it is, as you say, both a big opportunity right now to rethink our approach to Africa, but there's also a big need to do it, because of course the geopolitical situation with I think the biggest setback for globalization in 30 years, where trade barriers and protectionism and economic nationalism is back on the top of the agenda. We have a war in the Ukraine, and a lot of the official development assistance will be redirected in that direction. We have a war in the Middle East, ongoing crisis, humanitarian situation there. And of course, a lot going on in other places as well. Trade war between the US and China. And my fear is that the developing world is going to be affected the hardest from this change in geopolitical circumstances. When we see rising interest rates, for instance, in the Western world, what happens to investments? Private investments in developing countries, well, they are pulled back because the financial risk will be too high. So, and also with globalization being rolled back, what does that mean for countries who need access to global markets in order to thrive? And developing countries are definitely in that category. So the whole energy transition will be more costly, take a longer time because of all these steps. Geopolitics is becoming a factor in all policies, I think, and you're quite right that Africa has resources that are valuable for the green transition and the value chains that we need to build up in order to succeed with everything we have to do. But I fear that this new era of protectionism is not boding well for those countries who have these resources. It could have been so much greater potential. So little is new in the Africa strategy, unfortunately. It's the old record played again and again, and I think it's a lost opportunity.
Well, I mean, you're not pulling any punches on that one. What would you have liked to see more of in more specific terms? Now, one of the areas where we've seen a real shift in recent years, and this is really accelerated, is we all know that historically the relationship that much of Europe, much of the West has had with Africa has been very much focused on overseas development assistance and aid. And the goalposts have shifted quite significantly, and there's a much stronger emphasis now on trade and investment. And we're seeing a lot more investment coming from all sorts of parts of the world. Not just from Europe, but of course we know that China and Asia are heavily invested. We're seeing much more investment coming in from the Gulf states. I'm guessing here that that's an area where maybe more could be done. But if you could maybe sort of have a checklist of a few things that really ought to be in there.
Well, I think that as you were pointing to, I think that investments and mobilizing more private capital should be at the core of an Africa strategy, because official development aid can only be the icing on the cake, and we need to think very carefully through how we use that money. Even though Norway spends about 1% of our gross national income every year on development aid, and that amounts to about 60 billion NOK a year. That's a lot of money by any measure. It's still just a drop in the ocean when it comes to the needs of African countries. So if we can use those billions to mobilize trillions, then we have really done something that I think would make a difference for people's lives, because too much of our long-term development assistance is not focused on systemic change. In order to achieve systemic change, we need private investments in the energy sector, in the agricultural sector, in basically any sector that can deliver jobs and growth in these economies, and be the basis of domestic resource mobilization in terms of tax income that can be spent on education and health and the things that we really know will have to be the foundation of long-term development. So a lot to be done. I also think there's a sad lack of focus on how new technology and digitalization can play a huge part in fast-tracking the development process in many African countries. Now, I'm of course a bit biased because I launched the first digitalization strategy for our development policy back in 2018, and also that was the prerequisite for a white paper on the same topic. And now it seems to be sort of out of the loop. But both in our humanitarian work and our long-term development assistance, I do believe that new technology can make our dollars reach longer and have a more profound effect, and make sure that developing countries can leapfrog many of the steps on the ladder that developed countries have climbed. Now there are many good examples of this. I mean, how, for instance, M-Pesa in Eastern Africa has made it possible to leapfrog across building physical bank buildings and right straight into the digital economy, and how, for instance, building resilient tax and robust tax systems through new technologies can really do something for domestic resource mobilization and helping countries and making them able to invest in the core priorities of their country. So that should be a bigger focus, I think. But I think it was just this new Africa strategy was a series of platitudes, I think. Nothing new, and there was nothing about what have we done in the past that we should do differently in the future. No mention of sort of past mistakes and future new innovations to make things better for our relationship between Norway and Africa. It's a bit harsh, maybe, but it's. I'm in the opposition. I should say that.
I was just going to comment on that. You are in the opposition, but that may not be indefinitely the case. Norway, of course, is heading for elections next year. It sounds to me as if if your party comes back into government, we might see a reevaluation of the Africa strategy. Is that something that might be on the cards here?
I think we should see that for sure, because if we look back, Norway has been engaged with Africa for 60, 70 years. What have we achieved? Not a lot, sadly. I mean, we've helped a lot of individuals. We've done some good work on capacity building. But if we add up the money spent, have we spent it in the right way? I think we need to reevaluate and see, okay, we need to do more of what works and less of what doesn't work. And I think in politics, it's a bit like when you have a growing budget, you fail to make the necessary priorities. So you add on a new priority on top of all the others. And in the end, you just prioritize too much. So it's not actually a priority. Every new minister comes in with a new pet project, and then that sort of adds on top of the last 6 or 7 development minister pet projects, and that doesn't account for any priority at all. So I think we need to focus on, okay, where can we really make a difference? Doesn't mean we need to pull out of everything that we're doing apart from that, but we need to put the big money in the projects that we really do believe can contribute to systemic change. Because otherwise we will be going back and helping the same individuals every year. And that, of course, is sometimes necessary, especially when we're talking about a humanitarian crisis. And they are long and they are severe and they have huge human impacts. But that can't be the only focus.
I think it's worth just re-emphasizing a point you made earlier, which is that it's not only desirable to reassess your approach to Africa, but it's also becoming increasingly necessary. Because one of the realities that's changed is that the landscape is just much more competitive. There are many more players now on the continent, and they are pursuing much more aggressive policies in terms of really driving the trade and investment angle. I think that you make excellent points around the need for systemic change. And business as usual, it's going to be hard to carry that on. So look, I have no doubt that the debate will continue in Norway, and with individuals like you involved, it sounds like it's going to be a very healthy debate. Let's put it that way. But turning back to international development policy now, I think it's important to make the point as well. It's not a zero-sum game, right? It's not either or. You don't either have ODA or investment. There's got to be some sort of relationship between the two. And you use the term, it's got to be the icing on the cake, development assistance. Could you just maybe talk a little bit more about how does development policy in general need to evolve and adapt to the new realities of a continent like Africa in order to turn those millions or billions into trillions of dollars, which is exactly what we need to see flow into the continent over the coming years?
I'll answer that, but as a good politician, I will also answer something you didn't ask about. But the point you made on other actors being involved in Africa, in the continent, I think that's very pertinent. And we need to engage with them as well, because now it's too much the traditional ODA countries, OECD DAC countries really, who talk to each other about how they should approach development aid. And then you see actors like China or other middle-income countries around the world who are both investing and aspiring to be donor countries, but we don't really talk to them. and we don't have a coordinated strategy. And it was interesting because when I was minister, I went to Beijing and I talked to the newly established development agency there. And I was expecting them to have a rather different approach than they actually do. Because what I found was that this new development agency has nothing to do with all the investments that China are making in Africa. They are completely separate. So what the development agency does is basically old-fashioned development aid, handing out sewing machines and that kind of thing. Whilst the state of China, which is another part of the state of China, is investing heavily in infrastructure and roads and rail and everything, and not least the energy sector. But there seems to be a sort of disconnect between how that leads to development. And that's maybe because they have a different approach to the whole thing. I mean, the investments they make on a commercial basis, a need to invest currency abroad, and many other concerns, not really to achieve development in Africa. I also asked my Chinese colleague if there were any lessons learned from China's own journey over the last 30 years. And he said no. No lessons learned that are relevant for Africa. And that just tells me that we need to talk to each other more and not see this as a competition, but how can we have complementary efforts that really make a difference, and efforts where we make sure that the recipient countries are actually in the driver's seat, because otherwise we're not going to succeed. Now, for instance, I went to Malawi, and they have a policy that all donor countries, they cannot have more than 3 priorities, right? Which is like, it makes sense. The problem is that all the donors have 3 different priorities, so it adds up to 30 priorities, and then that's no longer a priority, and the country doesn't have the capacity to absorb these efforts and underpin it with domestic sort of work in addition to make it happen and succeed. But to your question on how do we use our development aid efficiently to achieve the agenda of development and not least more trade and investments. And I think there are a lot of instruments that we can use. For instance, Norway has a AAA rating. So Norway can guarantee for investments. We know that financial risk is too high in many places, where the perceived risk is too high, and it comes on top of regulatory risk and political risk. So using our financial muscle to take down that risk for private investors, I think, is one way of doing it. Sweden has a very good guarantee scheme, which basically cost them 200 million Swedish crowns a year to run, but it mobilizes 90 billion Swedish crowns in loans and investments, which is great. So we can do that. Blended finance, where you have sort of an element of aid money to take down the risk, is one way. Norfund, of course, the Norwegian state-owned Norwegian financial investment company that invests in developing countries, is another. They invest in renewable energy and agriculture and whatnot, but they never do it alone, always in tandem with private companies. But it helps take down the risk. That's one way of doing it. I also think we need to look at how the World Bank and the regional development banks work. I think the feedback I get at least is that it's too bureaucratic and it's not readily available, and they are too risk averse. I mean, the World Bank has never lost money since it came about, so they have a very high risk threshold. And of course, when we guarantee investments through the banking system or these banks, then the road to the actual investment is quite long. So maybe we need to look at sort of regional development bank reform as well, as a part of a bigger package. And then, of course, tax systems. Tax systems are key. So anything we can do to build capacity is also helpful to achieve systemic change. And I think it's the OECD who says that the dollar spent in building tax capacity gives $100 back to the recipient country. And that's a multiplier effect that I think we should strive for in everything we do, actually, when it comes to aid, because aid money is not going to be available in the amount that is needed, and we see that already now with a lot of the aid money going to the Ukraine, and we need to aid the Ukraine and make sure that we sort of stand up to Russian aggression and stay that course. But it just means that we need to rethink how the money is going to last, also for all the other very important and pertinent tasks that needs to be performed in other countries.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the point around tax revenues. This, of course, is something that has become dramatically more important in recent years. As we know, a lot of African governments have been hit hard fiscally. And you mentioned earlier interest rates going up in the West. We all know the knock-on effect that has on dollar-denominated debt, and we've seen the impact of that in countries like Kenya. We've seen sovereign defaults. So, there were calls for more domestic revenue mobilization before COVID hit, before the invasion of Ukraine. It's more critical than ever. So just as an aside, but I want to come back to the point you made earlier, which I think is really important around we need to talk to the other players. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds to me like you're making a good case there for a return to multilateralism, yeah, and not being tempted and falling into this trap of protectionism and nationalism. A difficult sell in the current climate, particularly amid growing talk about geopolitical confrontation with China. A lot of the talk about China in Africa is we need to counter China. Sounds to me like you're saying, well, why aren't we talking to them? Why aren't we trying to find some common ground here where we can actually collaborate? I can't argue with that, but how realistic is that in the current climate?
Well, I think that it's realistic to talk to them. I'm not saying that that's necessarily going to lead to imminent agreement on everything, but if we don't talk to each other at all, then at least we know that there's going to be we're going to be lost in translation, to put it that way, and that's where we are today. But really, it's also about African countries who are engaging with both the Chinese on one side and maybe also some Latin American countries on the other side, and then the European traditional donors. They also need to be clear in their expectations and maybe build the bridges here and make different donors and investors talk to each other. They are in a position to do that. It's not really, of course, some countries may fear that if we start sort of having requirements in that way, you need to talk to each other, that the Chinese might pull out or and not do the investments that they are planning to do. But that said, I mean, the Chinese have made a lot of investments in Africa that not necessarily are beneficial to African countries in the short to medium term anyway, because they don't have the finances to service the debt that they have, that the projects bring them, and they don't necessarily get the benefits in terms of local jobs because a lot of Chinese come and do the job. So that's what I'm saying, that it's like, yes, we're open to investments, but we are also allowed to have some requirements, and we need to talk to each other to make things happen. Also engaging with the Chinese Development Agency and making sure that we actually share best practices on what works, what doesn't work, what kind of instruments will be beneficial. I think if you don't try, or there's no harm in trying, but yes, there is a geopolitical backdrop here, and I'm not being naive at all. And the Taiwan situation is, of course, a very serious backdrop to this conversation, which is, and it's also linked to how we respond in Ukraine, in my view, because we need to be quite clear that invading other territories is unacceptable in 2024.
We've also seen some of the geopolitics play out in Africa, particularly in the Sahel, over the last couple of years. Countries like Niger, and anxiety about a growing Russian presence there. So, look, I don't think there's anything naive about this. If you're not talking, your chances of getting anywhere are zero. So the one thing you can rely on is you're not going to make any progress if you're not at least talking. That, of course, having a conversation doesn't mean, as you said, you immediately reach an agreement. But what's the argument against it? I can't think of a good one.
No, and I think multilateralism is, yes, it's in crisis, it's under pressure and everything, but that's why countries who are in favor of multilateralism we need to take every opportunity to talk about the benefits of it. I mean, I come from a small country. Yes, we are rich, but we are a small country, and we live off selling things that we don't consume ourselves. So fish or aluminium or fertilizer or oil and gas. We don't really use much of it ourselves. We are completely dependent on access to a world market, and we are vulnerable to the big countries making their own rules on the side of the multilateral system. But the same is the case for developing countries. They are also vulnerable. When the big powers fight, we are all losers from that, including the big powers themselves. So, if you look at, as I said, with globalization, many African countries are poor not because of globalization, but because they're not taking part in globalization. If you look at the Chinese economy, why has it flourished? It's because they got access to the world markets. If you look at the exports from China after they joined the WTO, it's through the roof. So it's about. I understand that there are some products that where you need to have maybe some regulations to make sure that you can grow your own domestic sector before you are sort of exposed to competition. But the big picture is African countries, they need access to the markets, and they need to be open for business, open for investments, and they need to do their own homework in terms of reducing regulatory risk and reducing political risk. Because political risk is poison to investors. Regulatory risk is also very, very challenging. I've dealt with Norwegian companies who have been trying to invest billions in Africa, only to be met by a changing regulatory regime over many, many years. And in the end, they say, listen, we're giving up because this is not going to happen. Every time we think we're there, then something changes. So that's why when I was minister, at least, we tried to emphasize the work that we do on capacity building through the knowledge bank, as we call it in NORAD. And that's not only tax system, that's also renewable energy. It's used to be oil and gas and many other key areas where building a regulatory regime over time makes your country more open to business. And that's important.
Look, it's a two-way street, which brings us back to the point around dialogue, right? You need to talk.
It's a two-way street, and this is the thing. I also mentioned that I was participating in a debate a couple of years ago with a Norwegian bank, and they were talking about how sustainable they were. And I said, listen, it's great that you're changing your light bulbs, but what are you doing to facilitate investments in developing countries? And they went a bit quiet on that one, because the matter of the fact is that with EU regulations, if you do business in Africa and you try to send the proceeds back to Europe, you're met with a big, big red flag in most banks. And I talked to one businessman who'd been in Africa for 30 years, and he sold one of his businesses there. And to try to get the proceeds back to Norway was very, very difficult. So he had to send it through Hong Kong, because none of the European banks would touch the money. So we're fencing up in the world. I mean, the US is fencing up with more trade barriers and the IRA and everything. India has just put 40% tariffs on Chinese solar panels. That's going to slow down solar implementation in India, but over time it's good for Indian manufacturing, but still it's more costly, it takes more time. And of course, Europe is answering all this with a carbon border mechanism. And that's going to make it more difficult for African companies to compete in the European market. So, of course, there are good reasons for why everybody's doing this, but the sum of it, if you add it all together, it just means that some countries are going to lose out more than others, and I'm fearing that that's those who should lose out the least.
Well, there's a lot of risk to go around. I think there's any doubt about that, and I think you've dispelled any potential accusations of being naive with your analysis there. But in an attempt to try and end on a positive note, end this conversation on a positive note, there's this phrase that is, I think, most prominently attributed to the former White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel: "Never let a good crisis go to waste." Right, and of course, within all of the upheaval and volatility we're seeing, there's of course also a narrative around opportunity. And if we can go on a positive note, where do you see some of the opportunity here to kind of redefine the relationship with Africa and drive real development?
Well, I mean, there are huge amounts of potential in Africa. You have the youngest population in the world, lots of skilled people. You have lots of natural resources, and I think we see that there are opportunities if we do things right. I mean, the investments will come, but we need to be smart about how we go about it to make sure that it really happens. And if we do this right, then I think investments will have an uptick, and that will lead to longer term development goals being met, or at least being close to be met, and that starts a positive spiral, so to say, of like rings in the water of positive development initiatives. So I think there is a lot to be said for Africa on a positive note, and we shouldn't forget that. It doesn't mean that we still need to address sort of the challenges, but most of the challenges can be overcome. I mean, that's what humans do. We overcome challenges, and we can overcome these as well. As long as we work together and talk to each other, I think that's a good starting point.
It's not easy, but it's possible, and that's the most important thing. Nikolai Astrup, thank you so much for joining the NABA Perspectives podcast, and thank you for being so honest in your perspectives. I think, given the world we're in now, it's more important than ever, I think, to not beat around the bush. So it's much appreciated.
My pleasure. Thank you.